worked with a woman who was blind. And she could, I'm going to drive you crazy now, but I'm going to walk over here. She could trail, meaning she could find her way around the building, following along. But if there was ever anything in her way, like someone left a chair in her way, if a door was left open, she'd get upset, she'd bite her hand, she'd fall on the ground, she'd bang her head on the floor. So they couldn't let her just walk around the building because she'd engage in behavior problems. So what did we do? Well, we taught her how to communicate for help. Now, I'm reaching in my pocket to pull something out. I'm always afraid about what I'm going to pull out. One time I pulled out cheese. I had some wrapped cheese in my pocket. Why I had wrapped cheese, I don't know, but it was there. Anyway, what we did for her was, we're going to teach her, now she was blind, she wasn't verbal, we were going to teach her how to ask for help. So what do? Well, we sent her trailing, and we deliberately put things in her way. She gets stuck. As soon as she gets stuck, before she gets upset, we put something in her hand that says, "Help me." Tap her hand, she gives it back to us, we move the chair out of the way, we send her on her way. Further down the hall, another obstacle. Maybe the door is left open. She gets stuck. Put this in her hand, tap her hand. She gives it back. She was also deaf, by the way, so we didn't use verbal prompts. Tapped her hand, she gave it back to us, sent her on her way. Then we faded the prompts. She gets stuck, we put this in her hand, we tap her hand, but we move our hand away. So she has to search a little bit. Finds our hand, gives it back to us. Next time, put it in her hand, tap her hand, move her hand a little bit further away. Two things happen here. One is she has to search. Another thing, she has to wait. Okay, we're trying to build in now a delay, that we're not going to be able to respond immediately, but if you persist, you'll get help. Did this over the period of a couple of weeks, probably a couple of months. Got her to the point where she'd reach into her pocket, pull this out, and do this. And she could wait for a minute or so. So we sent her down the hall. This was the test. Put chair in the way, sent her down the hall. She gets stuck. She reaches in. She does this. And she waits. She waits. And one of the secretaries came by. Looks at it, says, "Help me." She goes, "Oh, honey, is that chair in the way? Let me move it." Boom. Okay. What happened? The secretary didn't know anything about deaf blindness. She didn't know anything about augmentative communication systems. She didn't know anything about autism, severe behavior problems, but she knew if someone is communicating, "Help me," you look around to see what it might be, and you try to help. Okay? That's what we were trying to do. We're trying to get her, the woman who was deaf and blind, to be able to communicate to the world what she needed, instead of trying to anticipate everything. And this kind of goes back to the prevention issue I talked about, the short-term prevention issue I talked about before. We could have, every time we sent her out, sent someone out ahead, moved all the chairs away, made sure all the doors were closed, made sure all that happened. We could have done that, and that would have solved the problem in that building. But she was going to find an obstacle somewhere else. And what we really need to do is teach her, what do you do when you have an obstacle? Okay? You're going to find it. And the world isn't an easy place that you can rearrange like that. So you're going to find it. We need to build this in so that you know how to deal with it when it happens. Okay? We need to find a way for them to deal with the world. We're not going to change the world the way we want to, so we need to find a way for them to deal with the world. This is part of a large study that we did to look at this phenomenon again. We had two groups of kids. We took basically all kids who had attention-getting behavior problems. People would get upset when they didn't have attention. I split them into two groups. One group who got a traditional timeout. So if you get upset, we're going to turn away. And these are the second part of the study. What we did was found a naive teacher. In New York, there is one. We found basically teachers, and we didn't tell them what we were doing. So what we said was, could you work with this kid on this task, but didn't say anything about a behavior problem. And kids, all of them had behavior problems. We then put them with the timeout trainer, And they use timeout and the behavior problems go down. But then when they went back with the naive teacher who wasn't using timeout, the behavior problems come back. Why do they come back? Because they're not using timeout. Okay, so they're not doing the program. If they're not doing the programs, the behavior problems come back. Back with the trainer who's using timeout, back with the naive teacher not using timeout, and then we did functional communication training here just to see if it worked. And we had a number of kids, and this is it's a similar pattern. In the second group, we had functional communication training. Before we did the communication training, naive teacher, lots of behavior problems. With the trainer who taught them to communicate. And now with the naive teacher. What happened? How come the behavior problems didn't come back? Because we taught them to say things like, am I doing good work? When we teach them to say, am I doing good work, the naive teacher doesn't have to be trained. When a kid asks you, am I doing good work, you respond to them by talking to them. No, they know how to do that. They responded. Behavior problems stayed down. Trainer, naive teacher, trainer. Okay? What's the point? The point isn't, like in timeout, just to reduce the behavior problems. The point is, if you're going to get this to work, it has to be something that other people can respond to. Anyway, Jim, Ken, Bob, and Len. I've now learned subsequently now that you can have search and replace, so you can actually put whatever you want in and then change it later. But anyway, Jim, Ken were rocking. Bob and Len were hand flapping. What's the motivation? Remember the 4 categories? Sensory, 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 tactile, sensory, tactile, sensory, sensory. Escape. Attention. Well, the real answer is, I don't know. We didn't do an assessment. Okay. The lesson here is don't ever assume you know why a behavior is occurring just by looking at it. In fact, rocking and hand flapping were occurring to escape. When we did an assessment, we found out that they rocked and hand flapped more when we gave them things that they didn't want to do. So our intervention was to teach them to ask for help, and it went down. Never, never assume by looking at a behavior problem why it's occurring. I'll give you another example. This is another study we conducted on a boy, one of my favorite people of all times. He would engage in psychotic speech. First time I ever met him, I walked into the classroom. He was sitting at a table with a teacher. Teacher looked up, said hi, turned to him and say hello to Dr. Durant. And he said, looks up at me and says, I stepped on my mother's grave. Blood spurt out of the tombstone. And then he went back to work. And I kind of went, hi. If you walk down the hall with him, I remember walking down the hall and holding his hand, and he looked up at me and said, parachute now? I'd say, no, not now. Or you'd be working with him and he'd go, Daddy said. What did Daddy say? He would say things out of context, unusual kinds of things. We called it psychotic speech. When I asked his teacher actually had filled out one of the earlier versions of the motivation assessment scale, and it was very odd responses. So I asked the teacher, well, why do you think he's engaging in psychotic speech? And his teacher's answer was, because he's psychotic. My response was, well, that's not one of the 4 categories that we have. So let's do an assessment. And we did an assessment on his psychotic speech and found out that he engaged in psychotic speech more often when we asked him to do something he didn't want to do. In fact, the treatment at the time for him was timeout. So if he said something unusual, he was sent to timeout. Now originally, his psychotic speech may not have been escape motivated, but sure it was learning. If you say something unusual, you don't have to work anymore, and they put you in the corner. So what we did was gave him things that were difficult, looked at his psychotic speech during baseline, then taught him to say, help me. Psychotic speech goes down, and this is his use of the phrase, help me. We went then back to baseline where we stopped responding, and there's a reason why we had to do this. He stopped saying help me and went back to engaging in psychotic speech. And then we did this condition, help me plus praise, where we would give him something difficult, he would say help me, and instead of helping him, we'd say, nice talking, that's great, good job, but we didn't help him. If we didn't help him, psychotic speech went back up and he stopped saying help me. Okay? We wanted to demonstrate that there's nothing magical about saying words. He could say potato famine, and if he got help, then that would have worked. Okay? So it was nothing magical about what he said, it had to do with what the response was. So once he got help, psychotic speech went down and he engaged in the phrase we taught him. Okay? So in our early studies, what we had to demonstrate to people was this wasn't somehow just physically replacing it. So you can't say psychotic speech at the same time you're saying help me. No, that's not the point. It's functionally incompatible, meaning if I get help, I'm not engaging in psychotic speech to escape anything. Another case comes to mind, a woman that I worked with once who had a lot of verbal skills, but also a lot of psychotic speech. And she would say things like, who, what, Susie? Never forget, who, what, Susie? And it wasn't really clear why this was happening. One day I walked in on a couple of staff, one old staff member and one new staff member, and the old staff member was saying, go ahead, say it, go ahead, say it. Who, what, Susie? And they would laugh. Go ahead, say it. Who, what, Susie? And they would laugh. Now, I was upset. One, because this wasn't something we were trying to encourage. Two, that they were ridiculing her. But what it became clear was she might be saying who, what, Susie, because this is her only way to interact with people. She can't say, you know, how'd you like the Yankees last night, you know, or what'd you do this weekend? But she could say who, what, Susie, and people would laugh. So she would go up to staff and say who, what, Susie, and they'd say things like, oh, you know, you shouldn't say that. You know, you're not supposed to say that. Part of your program is that you don't say that. And they'd have a nice long conversation about how she wasn't supposed to say that. And then they'd move on. And then she'd come up to somebody else, like, who, what, Susie? Oh, no, you know, you're not supposed to say that. You know, that's not right. You know, what are you supposed to do? I'm not supposed to say that. Right, you're not supposed to say that. What was happening was a nice social conversation. And she was using who, what, Susie to initiate it. Okay, so was this some bizarre psychotic behavior? No, this was a form of attention getting that once we figured that out, we could replace that. What we need to do is teach her another way to initiate conversations, initiate attention from other people. Okay? If you just look at it on the surface, psychotic speech, you think out of her control, she's hallucinating, something bizarre is happening. If you look at it functionally, sometimes, even in these cases, they are things that serve a purpose. And even though she could talk, she didn't have the social skill to go up and interact with people. Once we could do that for her, she didn't engage in who, what, Susie as much anymore.